but I hope you walk away knowing a little bit more about this phrase that many of us have heard so much about. So I'm going to share my screen now. I'm going to ask Pastor Stacy if there's something that comes up in the chat. Do you mind reading it? If it's urgent, feel free to jump in at any time.
Sure, I will.
Okay, thank you. All righty, so now I'm going to share my screen. All right. Let us get started here. The politics of Jesus in Project 2025. Notice who is first. We put Jesus first. And I think that is important because no matter who is in charge in the White House, no matter the administration, Jesus is always in charge in our lives. And that is why we call ourselves Christian. So we're going to center ourselves with a scripture. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about me. As she mentioned, I am a lifelong member. I'm a back row faithful. There are 4 of us who always sit on the back row. I say I secretly voted for Pastor Stewart when she was elected as the pastor of our church. I say secretly because I was technically too young to vote at the time. I believe the cutoff age was like 15 and I was 14, if I remember correctly. But my father, who is on the roll, but who does not attend on regularly, took me to the voting booth and said, Ducky, that's what my dad calls me. So you guys can't call me that, but my dad calls me Ducky. He says, Ducky, this vote is going to mean more to you and your future than it will to me and my past. And so I pushed the button for Pastor Stewart, and it was one of the best votes I ever took. I pushed another vote button on Saturday, and I was so proud of that button too, but I'll keep that one to myself. But if you see my fingernails on my page, they tell the story. I am a public historian, scholar, and writer. I am also a PR executive who promotes social good. My brand is impact and social good. If I don't believe it, I can't promote it. And lastly, I was recently selected as an Obama leader in the Obama Leader USA program. I mentioned that because that is a fellowship of 100 leaders around the US who are really working on expanding our impact. But I also wanted to mention that because some of the things about the global rise of authoritarian rule comes from that presentation that I heard with them about 2 weeks ago. And so that was very important to talk about this national topic and put in global perspective for me. And so I just wanted to give a nod to that program and that session. So that's a little bit about me. Let's go to the next slide here. All right, this is our centering scripture. I have used the Message version. When the 10 others heard about this, they lost their tempers, thoroughly disgusted with the 2 brothers. So Jesus got them together to settle things down. He said, You've observed how godless rulers throw their weight around, how quickly a little power goes to their heads. It is not going to be that way with you. Whoever wants to be great must become a servant. Some of you might know this passage because it goes on to have that famous verse, not to be served, but to serve, which is actually the motto of my undergrad, Wellesley College. And I love this. I love how the Message version deals with this scripture. You've observed how godless rulers throw their weight around and how quickly a little power goes to their heads. So our overview today, we're going to talk about the what, the historical perspective of Project 2025, and global lessons in authoritarianism. We're going to talk about the so what, the federal impact and the Tennessee impact, because I always want to localize things when possible. And then we're going to talk about now what, strengthening our democracy. At any time, if you have something to say, I invite you to put in the chat. I can't read the chat and present, but I welcome Pastor Stacy to jump in at any point if there's something in the chat that she wants to uplift. So let's start with the historical perspective. I am a historian by training, and I always think it's important for you to know how we got here, right? How did we get to this moment in 2025? How did we get to Project 2025? So the origins of Project 2025. It actually started a few decades ago. Justice Lewis Powell urged corporations, so this is a Supreme Court justice, to play a larger role in politics to protect their interests. And that is him on it's my left. I hope it's your left as well. I'm not sure, but the one in the white shirt with no coat. This led to corporate political mobilization to influence policy, law, and public opinion. So 2 years after this famous memo, which is called the Powell Memo, the Heritage Foundation was formed. The Heritage Foundation formed in 1973 by Joe Coors Sr. to craft conservative public policies focusing on deregulation and campaign finance reform. This is 1973. All right. And we've heard a lot about campaign finance reform lately. I almost put another picture on here to tell you who Joe Coors was, but I wanted Pastor to invite me back. But some of you might recognize that last name, Coors. Does anybody recognize that last name, Coors? Where is it from? It's from a famous product that some of you may or may not partake in. Beer, yes, 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 Coors Beer. So this is the Coors Beer family that has been instrumental in the crafting of the Heritage Foundation, which led to Project 2025. All right, so when many people talk about Project 2025, they're really talking about the Mandate for Leadership, which is this 900-page book. The Mandate for Leadership is actually not new. The first edition of it came out in 1981. The Heritage Foundation's policy blueprint adopted by the Reagan administration to undo some of the reforms of the New Deal and the Great Society. The Reagan administration adopted 60% of the regulations in the Mandate for Leadership. They enacted tax cuts, deregulations, and social programs. So 60% of his agenda came from this Mandate for Leadership. That was the predecessor of Project 2025. So let's fast forward the clock to 2024, or 2023 actually is when Vance made this statement. I should correct that. J.D. Vance said, the Heritage Foundation isn't some random outpost on Capitol Hill. It has been the most influential engine of ideas for Republicans from Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump. Now, I have on there Senator J.D. Vance, which is still Vance's technical title. But who else is J.D. Vance? How else do we know that name? That's right, he is now Trump's running mate. He actually made this comment before he was selected for the VP position. Oh, I don't know how. I skipped all the way down. We got to skip all the way back. Look at that. All righty. Sorry about that. I don't know how it jumped so far. All right, we are back on track. So Project 2025 is a half century in the making. There are 4 pillars that you should know when we talk about Project 2025. First is the policy agenda, which is really the mandate for leadership. The next is the personnel database. The personnel database is probably the other big item that people talk about when they talk about Project 2025. The personnel database is a database of people, candidates who could be ready on day one to serve in the federal government as civil servants. It's candidates who will be ready on day one to take jobs in the federal government. What the Heritage Foundation has done is go on a series of tours across the country to find people who align with their values and agenda and who can help them push their agenda through. We'll talk about that more later. There's also the Presidential Administration Academy. You can see those videos, those training videos on YouTube right now. And this is training on how to work in the federal government and how to get things done in the federal government. And the first 180-day plan. That is the only thing that so far has not been made public. I have not seen it. Last I checked, it was not public. This is actually the 9th iteration of the Mandate for Leadership. It's crafted by more than 150 conservative leaders. And what is the agenda of this Mandate for Leadership, which is commonly known as Project 2025, this 900-page manual? The agenda is dismantling climate regulations, weakening financial discrimination and healthcare protections, replacing civil servants with loyalists, and limiting dissent. But we know that there is a real mandate for leadership. All right, and this is the mandate for leadership that we turn to. So just on these first few slides, I want to pause and just take a beat here and ask, how does this concentration of corporate power, this marriage of corporate and political power misalign with biblical teachings on justice and the common good? So I'm going to pause right there to take some to allow you to unmute if you're in a quiet place and jump into the conversation, but then also to see if I can read the chat, and I invite Pastor Stacy to help me read the chat. How does this concentration of corporate power misalign with biblical teachings on justice and the common good?
One focuses on the needy, the misunderstood, or the forgotten, and one focuses on the corporate entity and the wealth of a nation.
Yeah, so this focus on wealth, health, helping the wealthy versus helping the needy. Yeah. Other things that are lifted. I think it's Deacon Jones. Is it Deacon Alicia Jones? The Bible speaks of loving our neighbors as ourselves.
No, ma'am, it's not Deacon.
Okay. All right. The Bible speaks of loving our neighbor as ourselves. Corporate power is about wealth and self-preservation. Yes, the difference between loving others and self-preservation, between helping others and self-preservation. And I see Mr. Smith, it is one-sided just for the powerful. Exactly. So we see this moment in the 1970s where there is this marriage, and there's always been a marriage of corporations and politics in U.S. history. Like, I don't need to remind you of the 1600s and how many people of African descent got to this country. There's always been this marriage of business and politics, but it accelerated at this moment, or it took a different turn. So here is one quote from our real mandate on leadership. He has shown you, or scripture, he has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. To walk humbly with your God. And when I think of this, walking humbly, I don't only think about it as our posture or positioning towards God when we go to God in prayer, but also how we treat others, right? Also how we treat our neighbors, also how we treat folks who don't have access to wealth and capital and influence, to walk humbly with them, to recognize the God in them. So now I want to take a shift from the historical perspective to global lessons in authoritarianism. So I thought it would be good to take a pause and kind of define this word authoritarianism, because it's being thrown around a lot. And I know many of us know, but just for those who haven't studied civics since 8th grade, here's a refresher for you. Authoritarianism is a system of government characterized by strong central power, limited individual freedoms, and censorship. So when we talk about centralized power in the president versus the three branches of government, right? And we know our three branches of government are, I'm going to wait for somebody to unmute themselves and see who has that eighth grade civics. What are our three branches of government?
Executive branch, legislative, and
And
judicial.
judicial, yeah.
That's right. Executive, legislative, and judicial. So there are checks and balances between the three branches. When one goes too far left, the other one pulls them back right, or at least that is how it is supposed to be. When you have centralized power, that means all of the power is falling in one branch or is coalescing around one branch. And what Project 2025 does, one of its primary goals is to make the executive branch or the presidency the strongest branch of government instead of all three being balanced. Limited freedoms due to freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, that is freedom of assembly is freedom to protest, and freedom of association being challenged increasingly. These words, assembly and association, are what we will see in the Constitution, but it just means freedom to protest and freedom to join whatever organization we want to join to express our political views or to express our identity without facing backlash or criminalization for it. Suppression of dissent through censorship and force. So what does this mean? Anybody who's in the opposition, right? And we'll get to more ways that that is happening in particular. And then the final is cult of personality, with the leader portrayed as a heroic figure, and dissent is equated with unpatriotic or disloyalty, right? Dissent is unpatriotic or it is disloyal. Now, this is a shift from what we have traditionally held in American government and American politics, that dissent is unpatriotic. Remember the Boston Tea Party, right? Remember the American Revolution. We were founded, our nation, our very nation was founded on dissent, right? And so for us to be in this moment in 2024 with this Project 2025 agenda to say dissent is unpatriotic, this is actually a shift in the mandate for leadership. I'm having a little problems navigating, but let me see if I can pull this controller up. Yep. All right, why now? So that is something that historians always ask ourselves. Why at this moment is this happening? Why is there so much discontent in the atmosphere that's leading to these new movements and this rise of authoritarianism? First of all, we have an increase in economic inequality and insecurity. You guys have heard the gap between the middle class and the top 10% have grown. Something about my personal bio that I don't talk a lot about, but I think has really shaped who I am, is I have had the opportunity now to work at the second most expensive private school in the country. And I have also worked at the school system with the highest number of children in poverty. You do know that Memphis has the highest child poverty rate in the nation, right? You do know this, that Memphis has the highest child poverty rate in the nation right now. So I have worked with children of the 1% and worked at their schools, and I have worked with children who were born with a debt on their back. And when we talk about the growth between the haves and the have-nots, the growth and inequality, I have seen it writ large. And that is where some of this insecurity is coming. The 2008 mortgage crisis, remember the mortgage collapse, right? So that had some insecurity, that put insecurity in the system that some people still haven't recovered from financially. COVID-19 pandemic, of course, and deindustrialization. America doesn't make things like it used to. A lot of goods are now being made overseas. And as the kids say, some people feel some type of way about that, right? Some people didn't adapt to that change. And so that has caused insecurity and a rise in inequality. Technology advances. We have more sophisticated surveillance technology. When I turn on my phone, I do facial recognition. I have, when I walk towards my car, it unlocks automatically. It reads the Bluetooth that's on me, right? I don't have to touch the car. There are cameras everywhere, fingerprint recognition. All of that actually, that makes our life more convenient, it also makes it easier to surveil us. The rise of social media and the algorithms. And one thing that I will say about conservatives is that they adopted to social media and technology much quicker than progressives and were able to get a message out quicker. And with this, we also have targeted disinformation, with lots of it coming from overseas. And then finally, a decline in global democracy support. So you have the rising influence of China as a global leader, and we know that China is not a democratic country, it is a communist country. You also have the US avoidance of, quote, boots on the ground. So what does this mean? This means when there is a military conflict, like Russia versus Ukraine, there was a time when the US would send troops. But there has been so much backlash against that we no longer send troops on the ground, rightly or wrongly. Like there's so much pain from Vietnam, there's so much pain from Afghanistan, right? That we have really pulled back from going into countries and helping them defend their democracy. And this has actually caused a little bit of instability globally. And I just wanted to give you some examples of the way that we have a global rise in authoritarianism. We have Poland, which is reducing reproductive rights, which that should sound familiar. We have Italy, which is reducing LGBTQ plus rights. We have Tunisia, which is a country in Africa, which is exacerbating its anti-Black laws, anti-Black racism. And Hungary, if you watch the American news, you should have heard a little bit about Hungary lately. Hungary, the civil service politicized, leading to corruption and a loss of expertise. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the civil service, but the civil service is a group of employees that work for the federal government. And there are thousands of people who work in the civil service who have a protection against partisan influence. They cannot be controlled by the executive branch because they want them to be professionals who rely on research and science and data instead of partisan politics. And so they are actually governed, supervised by a nonpartisan body. We see the protections against the civil service rolling back in Hungary, and the US in Project 2025 attempts to model that. And the picture you see is Trump with the president of Hungary, and that his name is Viktor Orban. He is a big fan of Orban. He talks about him frequently. So here's another place where I have paused. I didn't say what would Jesus do, because we actually know what Jesus did do, right? Where do we see authoritarian rule in the Bible, and how did Jesus respond to it, right? Where do we see authoritarian rule in the Bible, and how did Jesus respond to it? I'm going to give you a moment to think about that question, to put some thoughts in the chat. And if you are in a quiet place, I welcome you to unmute yourself. Yeah, King Herod's dynasty. Yes, yes. Thank you, Keisha Miller. Yes. We see authoritarian rule in Herod's dynasty, absolutely. Where else do we see, and this is in the chat, where else do we see? Give to Caesar what is his, yeah. Where else do we see authoritarian rule in the Bible? The pharaohs, right? The pharaohs in the story of Egypt, right? The escape from Egypt was a escape from oppression, right? And so, yes, in many of our leaders and empires, we see authoritarian rule in the Bible. And I'd like to say this. Why did African countries like why did African countries like Tunisia become anti-Black, and where did the influence come from? I'm gonna take a picture of this so I can pause and come back to this one. I think some of this is due to the rise of immigration, right? So whenever you see a rise in immigrants coming to a certain area, there is typically a backlash, right? And so we know that a lot of the folks in Tunisia actually consider themselves Middle Eastern, maybe even Asian, but definitely Middle Eastern. And so when you have an influx of immigrants, just like you see in the US, where there is the claim, right, that a certain group, a certain population is coming over the borders and stealing jobs and committing crimes and straining public resources, it's the same thing in Tunisia, just with another set of people. Yeah. And then Terrence Smith said, where else we see authoritarian rule in the Bible? The trial of Jesus. Absolutely, right? Pontius Pilate and the trial of Jesus. Yeah. Great answers. So how would Jesus respond? So we know a couple of things. Jesus subverted power structures. He criticized religious and political elites for their hypocrisy and for their oppression. He disrupted the temple system, right? He challenged corruption. He confronted Pontius Pilate during his trial. He condemned Herod, so someone spoke of that, for his corrupt lifestyle. And he healed the sick and welcomed outcasts and marginalized. And so here we have our real mandate for leadership, right? The life of Jesus Christ, who tells us in his very being, in his scripture, in his words, and in his action, how we are to respond to authoritarian rule as Christians. This is not a time to be afraid, right? One of my favorite quotes from Shakespeare, I love Shakespeare, is screw your courage to the sticking post, right? This is the time to put your courage in front of you and go for it. Jesus did not respond to authoritarian rule by being silent, by being afraid, by shrinking. It actually emboldened him. And so now I want to get into some specifics about the federal impact and the Tennessee impact of Project 2025. The great thing is we need data scientists, we need historians, and data scientists and historians have been on their job. They have analyzed this thing front, back, left, right, and horizontal. So we actually know in numbers what this could look like for Tennessee. And I wanted to share some of those numbers with you tonight. So Project 2025, limiting dissent and eroding democracy. I almost put like ending dissent, but I didn't want to be I didn't want to be like, too drastic, but I think limiting is an accurate statement. So suppressing dissent by deploying military against protesters via the Insurrection Act. Right now, the US military cannot come in Memphis. Now the State Guard, but the US Army could not come in Memphis and quell a protest. There are separations between how much the federal government, especially the military, can interfere in a local issue or a state issue, right? But the Insurrection Act is this one sliver where it is possible if you say someone is mounting an insurrection. So who gets to define what's an insurrection, right? If I am protesting healthcare access for women, Is that really an insurrection? If I am protesting discrimination against Spanish people who speak Spanish, is that an insurrection? And so what we fear, or what Project 2025, I shouldn't even say fear, what Project 2025 promotes is using the Insurrection Act to quell more protests outside of DC. Weaponizing the Department of Justice for political investigations against opponents. I want to talk about this one with the bullet point that's right below it. Ending independence for the Department of Justice, the FCC, which is the Federal Communications Commission's EEOC, Equal Opportunity Commission, and NLRB, which is the National Labor Relations Board. I think I have them all right. You guys can correct me in the chat if I flub one. Right now, we have some federal agencies that once again are protected against partisan politics. They are overseen by a nonpartisan board, and the executive branch of government cannot interfere with these agencies. It allows the experts to do their job. It allows the experts to give their expert opinion, even if it might be something that Congress or the president don't want to hear, even if it might go against their agenda. It also allows a certain amount of stability, right? There are some positions you don't want rolling over every 4 years because you lose that institutional knowledge. I could go on there, but I'm going to pause, right? There are some positions you don't want rolling over because you lose the institutional knowledge, you lose that expertise. And so if the Department of Justice moves from this independent agency to an agency controlled by the executive branch or the president, then the president can use the Department of Justice to investigate anybody who he feels speaks out against him. That is authoritarian rule. That is what Project 2025 proposes. And the last two, fire up to 50,000 federal workers and replace some of them, of the expert civil servants, with loyalists. Project 2025 makes a claim, right, that the federal government is too bloated. You hear that all the time, right? It's too many people working in the federal government. So that's one claim. The other claim, and this is once again, we've had these manuals for leadership that have been around since the 1970s, 1980s. Here is something that is different. Project 2025 has gone around the country securing a database of potential personnel who could be ready on day one to work in the new President Trump, if he is elected, in President Trump's White House. Why? Why did they make this shift? And why do they want to move out so many civil servants? Just like we have 3 branches of government that form checks and balances against each other, civil servants also have a checks and balance system. Their job is sometimes to tell you things that you might not agree with. And what the Heritage Foundation found and what Trump found is that a lot of the civil servants who were independent minded, looking at the facts and the law, pushed back against his agenda during his only term in the White House. And there was frustration that they slowed down the Trump agenda. And so the Heritage Foundation sat back and said, how do we solve for this perceived problem? How do we get rid of the experts and replace them with our own loyalists, right? This is the personnel database that they are gathering right now. And this is why they have made tons of training videos that you can watch right now on YouTube that talk about how to execute the conservative president's agenda. And then I want to get to some specific things in Tennessee, and I'm wrapping up. I just have a couple more slides here. Social Security cuts. One of the things that Project 2025 proposes is raising the retirement age for Social Security from 67 to 69. That will impact 5.2 million Tennesseans and reduce their benefits. To be quite honest, I think that will happen whether there is a Republican or Democratic government. That is my opinion, but it's outlined in Project 2025. Healthcare. Raise the cost of prescription drugs for up to about 450,000, 460,000 people in Tennessee by eliminating the out-of-pocket Medicare drug cost limit. So right now there's a cap on how much you can pay in drugs in Medicare drugs. Project 2025 eliminates that cap, right? And so we have about 460,000 Tennesseans who will be affected by that. It also one of the big things with the Affordable Care Act was setting limits on how high some prescription drugs can be. Like, I think it's like the 20 most used or the 20 most common. Project 2025 erases that as well. And limiting disability benefits for veterans and automating claims affecting Tennessee's veterans. Automating claims, what is the difference between individual and a trained professional reading your claim for a healthcare benefit versus a computer? The computer has algorithms and programs that can be written to reject it at a higher rate. And we know that this has already happened, and it has happened here in Tennessee. And if you Google this very issue, you can see where the state of Tennessee had a big lawsuit and loss because of this very issue. Project 2025 and education and childcare. Project 2025 proposes to eliminate Head Start. That will affect about 20,000, 17,000 children in Tennessee and a good number of children right here in Memphis and Shelby County. It reduces access to childcare service in underserved communities. It also, there are some protections for student loan borrowers, for borrowers who have a fixed income, who are on a limited income. It once again gets rid of those caps. And so we think that student loan borrowers who are on the SAVE plan, right, because they're on a limited income, could see their payments increase by $2,700 to $4,100 yearly. And that is a huge jump for someone who is on a fixed income, who is just getting out of school, or who might have, not have the job that they expected after they got out of college, right? To say that your bills now, because we are reducing the income eligibility, is going to be, it's going to raise to almost $4,000. That's just a huge, huge jump. And public education cuts. It eliminates the U.S. Department of Education. It ends Title I funding, which will impact about 65,000 students in Tennessee. And we believe that that will lead to a loss of about 4,000 teachers across Tennessee. Let me say that again. We believe this will lead to a loss of about 4,000 teachers across Tennessee. This is Project 2025. And so now I want to turn to my final couple of slides, strengthening our democracy. Oh, did I misspell it? Let me see. Yes, I did. I knew that there would be a misspelling somewhere in this presentation, because I did it up to the very last minute. So here it is. All right. So how do we strengthen our democracy? One way, we vote, right? And we maintain our communities. So some of you have participated in the hashtags Christ Missionary Baptist Church vote, CMBC votes, and souls to the polls, right? Why is this important? Why is it important that we use these hashtags? It's important because as we show that we are participating in democracy, it actually encourages other people to participate in democracy, right? It actually encourages your neighbor down the street who may have been sitting this one out. This election will not be decided by the people who are enthusiastic. It will be decided by the folks who did not get up off the couch, right? And so anything that we can do to say, hey, I did this, I'm a part of this community. I don't have time to get into this point tonight. But one of the things, I'm going to tell you a very, very short story, and then I got to move on from this point very, very quickly. I was talking to a young lady recently who told me that she had joined it's a Black girl, told me that she had joined a Christian sorority. I was like, okay, so I looked it up. It was an evangelical sorority. I said, oh, okay. So, you know, me being an investigator, I dig a little bit more. The purpose of the sorority is to serve as a soft entry point into Christian nationalist ideas and into the evangelical conservative movement. Now, when I go back to this very impressionable young college student and ask her, why did you join this Christian sorority? She didn't talk about any of that. She said, well, they were very welcoming and inviting. And whereas the other sororities, they got to pick you, this sorority welcomed everyone. I want to make a point, and I don't have time to get into it too much today, but we are also in an epidemic of loneliness. We know that only about 50% of people across the country say that they have 3 good friends or more, and that number has cut in half drastically over the last 20 years. We know that loneliness has the same effect on an individual as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And yet the Surgeon General has warned that we are decreasingly not a part of communities. And there is a movement that is waiting to welcome the lonely. We have to get on our community. We have to. And when I talk about outreach, often we think about outreach as helping the least of these, and we should help those folks too. But what about outreach to the lonely? The lonely who could be susceptible to another group or organization because they welcomed everyone. And they use that as an entry point to indoctrinate them to another form of politics. That's also in Project 2025. So we have to not only vote, but we have to maintain community and welcome others into our progressive, loving, merciful, just community. And then lastly, how did Jesus respond to authoritarian rule? Jesus refused to compromise his message, even facing death. You cannot take my life, I lay it down. And the crucifixion is the ultimate sign of resistance against oppression, right? So we know that in the face of authoritarian rule, Jesus said the message of hope, the message of a beloved community, the message of justice is worth more than the threats, is worth more than the attempt to silence, the attempt to fire. Can we be as bold as Jesus in the face of authoritarian rule? And that is all I have for you tonight on the politics of Jesus and Project 2025. I'll now pause and open it up for questions.
I have a question. Dr. Scott, how do you think the Project 2025 is going to directly affect Black people as relates to diversity and inclusion?
Great point. There's so much in there that I did not pull out because I could have pulled out a lot of things, but that is one of the things that it also focuses on is eliminating anything that is a federal mandate for inclusive practices. I'm trying to see how to say this in the clearest way possible. There is a law. I'm not a lawyer. Let me just say that I'm not a lawyer, but there is a law or statute or policy that says it does not matter if the law did not intend to be racist or to have different effects on different demographics. What matters is that it did. Right? And we know that it did because we have the civil servants studying the impacts of these laws and these policies and say, hey, this is affecting Black folks a little bit different than it's affecting white folks. We can talk about the cocaine sentencing laws, right? Cocaine versus crack. We can talk about the fact that the civil service is the one who has for years brought to the attention that people of African descent, Black folks, were serving longer jail times than white folks. I'm talking about crime, but then I'm going to move to the workplace. If this protection that says it does not matter the intent of the law, it matters the impact of the law. If that protection is eroded, then we will have all of these laws on the books that will have a disproportionate impact on people of color and African Americans. So that's one way that it's going to hurt diversity and inclusion. The other way is it just gets rid of any diversity and inclusion offices in federal government. I mean, we saw that already with the first Trump administration, the first and only Trump administration. It will go right back to also pressuring states. So one thing that we know is that the federal government has already said that if schools have certain curriculums, if schools have an African-American history curriculum, or if schools teach certain things, that they will, the federal government, if Project 2025 and we get another Trump presidency, the federal government will withhold money from schools and universities. So although the federal government cannot directly go in and tell the school or the university what to teach or who to hire, what it can do is withhold funds if you teach something about African American history, or if you have a equal employment law. And that is how Project 2025 proposes to impact diversity and inclusion initiatives by tying it to federal purse strings.
Do you think that it's going to have the same effect in the private sector that it's going to have as it relates to the government sector? Or is it going to be worse?
The private sector has a lot of reasons to try to play nicely with whoever is in the executive seat, right? They get a lot of benefits from, we have a marriage of business and politics, right? And so there is always a shift, no matter who takes the seat, of the private sector in some ways falling in line with the executive agenda. It is not as big as we see in the public sector, but business leaders will do it because they want access to the president and they want access to the Oval Office. And if that means that they have to shift this policy or this program or initiative, they will. Now, we have the three branches of government. We have federal, judicial, executive, but we also have people power. And we cannot underestimate the importance of the power of the people. I know it sounds so cliche, but protests really do matter. People speaking up really does matter. Boycotts really do matter. And so what I want to say is no matter who gets in office, right? Is it November 6th, November 7th, the next day, the day after election, no matter who is in office, we did not lose the power of the people. If your candidate is not the one who wins the White House, you still have a voice in a collective movement. And we got to get back to community, and we got to get back to collective action, because collective action will make a corporation think real closely about whether I want to undo that diversity and inclusion program because the people push back. Right now, today, the Washington Post, who for the first time refused to endorse a presidential candidate, because of that decision, lost 8% of its subscribers. In less than a week, the Washington Post lost 8% of its subscribers. I say that to say an example of the power of the people. And the Washington Post is going to feel that 8%. So we have to vote, but we also have to remember our agency and our collective action. Other questions?
Yeah,
I have,
there's some other questions in the chat as well. Would you want me to read them or you gonna get to them?
I can see, let's see, so interesting.
Okay.
There are some states that already prohibit the use of the word equity in district education plans. This is 100% true. Will our kids in public school be required to take the military test? Yes, actually, this is already, someone says Bartlett moved to do this last year. Yeah, this is already a rule in Shelby County Schools. But certain states, certain school districts can require this. This is part of the ready graduation requirements that say a student has, I think it's, I don't know all the options, but I think you have like 8 options and you have to complete 5. It's something like that for the ready graduation requirements. And one of them is a military test or registering, taking that military test. So yes, some school districts already do this. I do see that growing. And once again, look for the federal government to tie funding to that if you do not complete this or if you don't do this, the federal government will withhold funding. The way that is, I believe that it's done in Tennessee is that it's not a mandate, but I think they're like, you have like 10 options and the student has to choose like 6 or 7 out of that 10. So it's something where it is encouraged, but not required. I think that is currently the law in Tennessee. What's your perspective on why African-American men are, I love this question. Thank you, Dr. Bowman. Yes, I'm not going to get on my high horse, but I actually think the question is, what is your perspective on why African-American men are strongly supporting Trump, given our history of oppression? I actually don't think African-American men are strongly supporting Trump. I think this is a narrative that the media has promoted. And I say that as a member of the media. And I also say that looking at the data. Like I've seen the polling data, and the polling data for, I don't want to quote the number because I haven't looked at it lately. But once I looked at the polling data, I was like, that's actually not as big of a number as I expected with all of the stories that have been made. I think there is a kind of campaign to show a fracturing in the African-American community and between African-American men, African-American women, and gender non-binary folks. I don't think that fracture is as big as kind of the stories are portraying. Now we know that Black folks are not a monolith, but once I saw the data, I remember having a conversation with one of my good friends, and I said, if I was a Black man, I'd tell them keep my name out your mouth because the data is not as bad as the narratives make it seem. So thank you for that question. Let's see if there's one more in the chat. I'm scrolling up a little. Okay, loneliness has the same effect as 15 cigarettes a day. And that is from the Surgeon General. The Surgeon General did a speech called Our Epidemic of Loneliness, where the Surgeon General studied that loneliness has the same effect as 15 cigarettes a day. I hope we can talk about that more. I don't think it's a coincidence that we have less people attending churches while we also have a rise in authoritarianism and a rise in loneliness. There is a gap here that we need all hands on deck to come together to figure out. I'll take one more and then we'll close. Continue divisiveness, yeah. What will happen to Title I? I don't know the answer to that. But what I do know is that Title I, what will most likely happen, what is proposed, and this is what often is proposed, is that, and I say I don't know because it will be different things in different states. That money, instead of going straight to school districts or instead of being earmarked for the school district, will go to the state, and the state will get to decide how to spend it. Now the state in Title I is extra funding that follows children in the most under-resourced areas and children who have the most complex education profiles, right? So it's funding specifically for this pool of children. Now, if that money is earmarked to support this pool of children with specialists, with accommodations, with special buses, right? What happens if the federal government says, I'm going to give that percentage to the state and the state gets to decide how to use it? Some states will continue to use it for that purpose, but that will be at the will of the governor. All right. So this is the last one. Oh, Dr. Carol Johnson Dean says Title I is earmarked for the poorest kids now. They want to spread it to the funds to others. Yeah. And I think the federal government and the states will make that choice, right? Thank you so much. If you don't know, Dr. Carol Johnson Dean is our former school superintendent. So whatever I said is wrong and whatever she said is absolutely correct. All right. And the last one, as it relates to Black males supporting Kamala Harris, would you agree that the narrative is being promoted to obscure the real truth of the waning white male support of GOP nominee? Ooh, I love this. Okay, so this is a good question to end on. The questions historians always ask is why now? Why now? Why now? I gave you a little bit of the why now with kind of the pandemic and the financial crisis, but there is another why now. And especially here in America, it is the browning. We have said long for a while, it is the browning of America, right? The moment where America becomes a majority minority or reflects the global majority, as we say, is a country of people of color, is fast approaching. And so when scholars and historians ask why now for Project 2025, a lot of the answers, some of the answers is because progressives have been winning for a while. Like the ideas of democracy have been advancing and bringing people together in these beloved multiracial community has been working. Not perfectly, right? There are flaws and things to learn, but democracy has been progressing. And so this, some historians say, is kind of like that last rally cry to see if we are losing political power in the popular vote. Because you do know the popular vote did not go to Donald Trump, right? The popular vote went to Clinton. Trump won the electors in his first presidency. So if they are losing that popular political power and they are losing the power of numbers, then yes, there is this rise of, the old South battle cry, right? Our way of life is changing. Our access to power and our amount of power is changing. And I'll leave you with this as kind of like the final note before we close in like a prayer or thought. I think it's interesting that Project 2025's agenda is to move so fast on day one. I think it's interesting because really the goal is to run up the score. And if you think of the word progressive and conservative, like divorce it from politics and just think of the denotation of the word, the dictionary definition. Progressives move fast, conservatives move slow. That is what it means to conserve, right? That is where that comes. Conservatives like slow, careful political change. And so when you get to a moment where your back is up against the wall and you are acting against your own identity and character, that speaks a lot to the fear and the frustration in the Conservative Party at the moment. And I'll pause there. Thank you guys so much for your good questions, for keeping me on your toes.